On March 9, 2021, Elias Varn motored out of Keldick Harbor in a 32-foot commercial fishing vessel called the Laurel Ann. He told the harbor master he'd be back in 4 days. He had fuel for 6. He was heading northwest toward the halibut grounds off Shuyak Island, a run he'd made maybe 200 times in his life. He never came back. No mayday, no emergency beacon, no debris field. The Coast Guard searched 11,000 square miles of open water over 9 days and found nothing. Not a life jacket, not a fuel slick, not a scrap of fiberglass. Elias Varn, 51 years old, born and raised in Kodiak, Alaska, a man who had fished those waters since he was 14, simply ceased to exist somewhere between the harbor and the horizon. That was March of 21. Welcome back to another video on my channel. To protect the victims, the names and places in this story have been slightly changed. If you have a story of your own to share, make sure to do so using the link down below. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. 18 months later, a supply pilot flying low over Afognak Island spotted something in a cove on the island's uninhabited northern shore. A boat wedged into the rocks, half swamped, listing hard to starboard. The registration numbers matched the Laurel Ann. What they found inside that boat made the disappearance itself seem simple. Keldick Harbor sits on the northeastern edge of Kodiak Island, tucked into a fold of coastline where the mountains come down steep and dark to the waterline. It's not a pretty harbor. It's a working one. Fuel dock, fish processing plant, a parking lot of gravel and cracked asphalt where trucks idle at 4 in the morning waiting for the boats to come in. The air smells like diesel and brine and the iron-sweet undercurrent of fish blood that never quite washes off the concrete. In winter, it's brutal. Wind comes off the Gulf of Alaska at 40, 50 knots, pushing horizontal rain that stings like gravel. The harbor chop gets ugly. Lines snap. Boats grind against the dock bumpers. Most fishermen with any sense stay on shore from November through February, patching gear, overhauling engines, drinking at Kowalski's tap and waiting for the weather to turn. Elias Varn was not most fishermen. He fished year-round. He fished alone. These two facts, taken together, made him an outlier in a community where outliers were already the norm. Commercial fishing in Alaska attracts a certain kind of person, someone comfortable with discomfort, someone who understands risk not as an abstraction, but as the texture of daily life. Even among these people, Elias was considered unusual. Not strange, that's an important distinction. The people who knew him didn't describe him as eccentric or troubled or reclusive, though an outsider might have used any of those words. They described him as quiet, self-contained, a man who seemed to carry his own atmosphere with him, like a pocket of still air in a windstorm. Elias wasn't antisocial, said Maura Kessick, who ran the bait and supply shop at the harbor for 23 years. He'd come in, he'd talk, he'd ask about your kids, but there was always this distance, like part of him was already out on the water, even when he was standing right in front of you, like he was listening to something you couldn't hear. She paused when she said this and then added, "That sounds weird now, doesn't it? Given everything. But that's how he was. That's just how he was." Elias Varn was born in Kodiak in 1969. The second of 3 sons born to Niels and Rosemary Varn. Niels was a fisherman. His father had been a fisherman. The Varns had been on Kodiak since the 1920s, part of a wave of Scandinavian families who came for the canneries and stayed for the independence, or the isolation, depending on who you asked. Elias's older brother, Geir, left Kodiak at 18 and never looked back. He became an electrician in Anchorage, married, had children, lived what he called a dry land life. His younger brother, Torsten, drowned in a boating accident in 1991. He was 19. The details of that accident are relevant later in this story, but for now, what matters is this. After Torsten died, something shifted in Elias, something that the people around him could sense but not name. He'd always been quiet. After Torsten, he became quieter. He'd always preferred the water to the shore. After Torsten, he seemed to prefer it exclusively. He wasn't grieving in any way I could put my finger on, Geir said years later. He didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't fall apart. He just contracted. like he pulled some essential part of himself inward, and what was left on the surface was functional, polite, competent, but not quite all there. Gear visited Kodiak twice a year for most of the 90s and 2000s. Each visit, Elias seemed a little more removed, a little more oriented toward the water and away from everything else. I asked him once if he was happy, Gear said. He looked at me like I'd asked him something in a foreign language. Not offended, just confused, like happiness wasn't a category he used. By 2021, Elias Varn had been fishing commercially for 37 years. He owned the Laurel Ann outright, bought her used in 2003, refitted her himself over the course of 2 winters. She was a solid boat, a fiberglass-hulled longliner with a small wheelhouse, a below-deck cabin just large enough for a bunk and a propane stove, and a work deck that smelled permanently of halibut and diesel. He'd named her after no one. When asked, he said he'd liked the sound of it. Like a woman's name, Maura Kessick recalled him saying. But not anyone in particular, just a name that sounded like she'd keep you safe. He lived alone in a small house on Mission Road, half a mile from the harbor. The house was unremarkable. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where he ate standing up. He didn't own a television. He had a radio, which he used for weather reports. He had a shelf of books mostly about navigation, tidal patterns, and marine biology. He had 1 photograph on the wall, himself and Torsten, ages maybe 12 and 8, holding a king salmon between them, both grinning. He had no internet service, no cell phone, no email address. These absences, remarkable to outsiders, were not especially notable in certain parts of Kodiak. Elias communicated by marine VHF radio when at sea and by showing up in person when on land. If you wanted to reach him, you went to the harbor or you went to his house. That's just how some guys are up here, said Deputy Harlan Fossey of the Kodiak Island Borough Police. Especially the old-timers, the lifers, they're not off the grid on purpose. They never got on it. This is the man who motored out of Keldick Harbor on March 9, 2021. A solitary, competent, deeply experienced fisherman making a routine trip in a reliable boat on waters he knew as well as anyone alive. And this is the question that, 18 months later, would consume linguists, investigators, cryptographers, and eventually agencies of the federal government. What happened to him out there? And what did he become? The morning Elias left was cold and clear. That's documented in the harbor log. Air temperature 28 degrees, wind from the north-northeast at 12 knots, seas 2 to 4 feet. Good conditions for early March. Not gentle, but workable. The kind of morning where an experienced fisherman looks at the sky and says, it'll hold. Maura Kessick saw him at the supply shop around 5:30 a.m. He bought bait, herring, frozen, 4 totes, and a new coil of longline. He also bought a tube of marine sealant and a box of Strike Anywhere matches. He paid cash, as always. He seemed normal, Maura said. Whatever that means for Elias, he was quiet. He mentioned the weather looked decent. I told him to watch the forecast for Wednesday. There was a system building in the western Gulf. He nodded. That was it. The harbor master, a man named Cal Pelletier, logged the Laurel Ann's departure at 6:12 a.m. Elias had filed a float plan the day before, destination Shuyak Island, northwest of Kodiak, roughly 60 nautical miles. He planned to fish the halibut grounds on the island's southwestern shelf, east where the depth drops from 200 to 600 fathoms over a relatively short distance. Good halibut water. He'd fished it dozens of times. Cal watched the Laurel Ann clear the breakwater and turn northwest. The running lights disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. That was the last confirmed sighting of Elias Varn or his vessel. What followed was 4 days of silence, which was expected. Elias didn't carry a satellite phone. He had a VHF marine radio with a range of roughly 25 miles, depending on conditions and antenna height. Once he cleared the shipping lanes, he was effectively unreachable. This wasn't unusual. Many solo operators in the Kodiak fleet worked without constant contact. The expectation was simple. You told someone when you'd be back, and if you weren't back, they raised the alarm. Elias had told Cal Pelletier he'd be back by March 13th, possibly the 12th, if the fishing was slow. On March 13th, the Laurel Ann did not return to Keldick Harbor. On March 14th, Cal called the Coast Guard. The search that followed was, by all accounts, thorough and well-coordinated. The Coast Guard Sector Kodiak dispatched a Jayhawk helicopter and a 110-foot cutter. The Alaska State Troopers provided aircraft support. Volunteer boats from the Kodiak fleet joined the effort, 14 vessels in total, covering a grid pattern that expanded outward from Shuyak Island. They searched for 9 days. The conditions were mixed. Good weather for the first 3 days. Then the system Mora had warned Elias about moved in from the west, bringing 35-knot winds and 12-foot seas that forced the smaller boats back to port. The helicopter flew when it could. The cutter stayed out. They found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no personal flotation device, no debris of any kind that could be linked to the Laurel Ann. The emergency position indicating radio beacon, the EPIRB, required on all commercial fishing vessels, never activated. Either it malfunctioned or no one triggered it, or the boat went down so fast there was no time. "That's the part that didn't make sense," said Lieutenant Commander Nadine Prokop, who oversaw the Coast Guard search operation. "Even in a catastrophic sinking, and I mean catastrophic, like a rogue wave rolling a vessel, the EPIRB is designed to activate on contact with water. It's automatic. The housing dissolves and the unit floats free and starts transmitting." She shook her head. "We never got a signal, not a blip, which means one of 3 things. The unit was defective, which we couldn't verify without the boat. The boat didn't sink, at least not in a way that submerged the EPIRB housing, or someone deliberately disabled it. The third option, at the time, seemed the least likely. Why would a fisherman disable his own emergency beacon? By March 23rd, the search was officially suspended. The Coast Guard report classified Elias Varn as missing, presumed dead. The cause was listed as unknown, likely weather-related incident. The Laurel Ann was classified as a total loss. Gear Varn flew from Anchorage for the memorial service, held at the Lutheran Church on Mill Bay Road. Roughly 40 people attended. The pastor spoke about the sea as both provider and taker. Maura Kessick read a poem she'd found in a book at the library. Cal Pelletier stood in the back and didn't say anything. There was no casket. There was nothing to bury. "It's the not knowing," Gear said, standing outside the church afterward, his breath fogging in the cold. "If there'd been wreckage, a body, something, you could grieve. You could say, this is what happened. But there's just nothing. An empty space where he used to be." He stared at the harbor for a long time. Then he said something that would later seem almost prophetic.